On today's In Print, Folklore, different tales of our culture, our lives, the people who make us all who we are. We'll also tell you about a really wonderful website that takes you on a tour through a general store of sorts of folk art and stories. Meet UCF Assistant Professor Natalie Underberg. I'm so glad you're here today because I just love these tales, folklore tales. And it seems like in our very fast-paced society, we've almost lost sight of who we once were, but these, even new ones, can bring us to our past and bring us a bit of our culture.
Absolutely, and that's really the main message that I have to share about folklore is, you know, it's traditional culture, and what that means is it's always changing, and it's always adapting, and what that means is it's living, and so it connects us to the past, but it continues to be around today because it has a meaning for us. It plays a role in our life.
And it's still important.
Absolutely.
Old message is still important. Okay, I'm folklore impaired. So tell me, is there a definition of it? Were they once just stories that were told that were later written down? Were they written at one time? Is it both?
Sure, I mean, folklore includes stories. It includes traditional art, musical traditions, dance traditions. It's expressive culture of communities, typically practiced by a person or persons, with some connection to community aesthetics, some idea of community taste, what is beautiful, what is interesting, what is important. And so there's always variation within that tradition because it's practiced by individuals. And so it's stories and art and other traditions.
We mentioned I mentioned a little bit that our world today, our technological world today, and folklore being something that has ties to our past. However, your research, some of your research at least, ties the two together.
Absolutely, that is my job. I'm the only person I know whose title is, you know, digital media and folklore. And so I love my job because I get to explore those very issues. My job is to find new ways to present traditional culture using new media. That may mean interactive websites, that may mean computer games. I'm not a technical specialist myself. My job is to try to envision projects and to help produce them and to study what they mean. And so that's the kind of work that I do at UCF.
And you actually have some of your writings talking about putting that together, putting the technology and the folklore together.
Yeah, I'm really excited. There's an article that came out in the Journal of American Folklore, which is the the Journal of the American Folklore Society. And it was actually about one website that we did. This was the East Mims Oral History Project website, which is near here, actually. Mm-hmm. And East Mims is a traditionally African-American community with a really rich history, ties to the citrus industry, civil rights leaders like the Moores. You may have heard about the Moore case, which was recently solved, in fact. And so what we did is we worked with the Brevard County Historical Commissioner and also community members to try to think of what would be the main themes to cover in a website that would be interactive. That would include video, that would include, you know, flash animation, recreation of scenes that people were talking about in their oral histories. So it's kind of an experiment of what can we do with these oral history materials, with these documented materials, to bring them to life. And so, you know, my job, I think, is not so much to document every single or share every single detail about an experience, but to try to use digital media to evoke the experience of what it felt like to be at that moment. What was it like to work in the citrus industry? How can we show that? Well, maybe we could make a flash animated sequence of illustrating what someone is describing when they used to smoke the groves. This was a process where they lit this really bad for the environment heater to try to keep the heat in to an orange grove when there would be a freeze. And imagine how perilous this was, how scared you would be that your orange groves were going to freeze.
Those were the days before the smudge pots, I guess.
In fact, I should have used the word the smudge pots. Mm-hmm. They were the smudge pots that they lit. Mm-hmm. And so these really talented, we have such talented digital media students who created, using flash animation, an animated sequence that showed that event. And then we could listen to the narrator describing that happening. And so that's the kind of thing that we like to do in the digital media division.
Did you have something in your writing that you wanted to share with us about the technology aspect of folklore?
Sure, I can read a few paragraphs from it, talking about really the process, that collaborative process of creating these products. So say the MIMS website has at its objective the use of technology as a tool for building community and providing new avenues for innovative cultural representation. The process incorporated several stages. The first stage involved oral history research with members of the MIMS community, focusing on aspects of local history. Combining the survey research with that completed by Brevard County Historical Commissioner Roz Foster and Moore Park Coordinator Juanita Barton resulted in a large amount of material from which to choose the story of this community. Making decisions about what to include and how meant reconciling at times diverse perceptions of story and representation. As a folklorist attempting to use technology to tell the story of this community, I was guided by a desire to try to tell the story of the MIMS community as they would have if they had had the same level of digital media skills as UCF students working on the project. Chantel Fontaine worked as the lead web designer for the overall site. She's now graduated and she's our full-time web designer for the Cultural Heritage Alliance, and she's amazing. While Lori Tiebert and Anna Zarkob created the original animation on the site. This involved repeated translation between the language of digital media and oral history. Dealing with documentation originally intended for an archive and using it for an interactive multimedia website meant sorting through a large amount of information with an ear or an eye, as the case may be, for story, and contextualizing folk life in terms of the script mentioned earlier. This had to be reconciled with paying careful attention to the material to look for repeated themes and eliciting oral literary criticism, which is Alan Dundas's term, of the narratives and information collected. Ideas for telling the community story were presented to the local historians and community consultants at several different points during the process to elicit feedback and check whether my sense of how to tell the story felt right to them. For example, the idea for making the overall site into a virtual tour of the town came from listening to the way that interviewees repeatedly oriented themselves to the geography of East Mims when recalling the past. So remembering a past time often meant remembering the former topography of the town. So it's an explanation of sort of how the project was conceived.
There's so much to consider.
There was a lot of material. The people of East Mims have done so much self-documentation and really working with the Moore Park, which was created on the site of where Harry and Harriet T. Moore lived, and in fact where their house was bombed. And so they created this community site on that same space. And it became a place where that project could sort of come together.
I would imagine hearing the oral histories, just the very beginning of it, must be so wonderful because these people, you're really getting a real sense and of closeness to these people.
I felt really fortunate that they would share the stories, with me. And I remember I was doing this with Roz Foster and Juanita Barton, and we were interviewing several people at a time, which is fun and which is not always
They start fighting about what they remembered?
Yes, and people say, and it wasn't so much they were fighting, but if you could imagine, having a shared experience, people would want to sort of pipe in and say, no, that happened, or, oh, that reminds me of this. And it became this sort of really energetic situation, and that's when I knew we got to put this on a website.
I want to talk about one of your other projects, which seems just another really fabulous thing, called Foodways, where you did a similar thing with the Paramore part of Orlando, and students working with students telling stories, their oral history, their folklore through food.
That was the first project actually that I worked on as a folklorist when I first came to UCF, and it was actually a project written by Kristen Congdon, who's the director of the Heritage Alliance, and Sterling Van Wagenen, who's now I think back in Utah making films, but he was the director of our school, and it was a good way to introduce university students into how to do ethnography, how to do documentation, while at the same time having the college students be mentors for kids in elementary and high school, and teaching them those same kinds of interviewing skills. So we did workshops at the schools, And the film students, did such a wonderful job, and they really bonded with the kids. And that became a way for two things to happen. One was for the students at Orange Center Elementary and Jones High School to go back to their families and collect recipes about traditional foodways and stories about them. And at the same time, for the film students to get to know in that kind of organic process, like you know very well about, of getting to know people and getting a sense of what's a good story, what's interesting. And as a result, they made a series of really great short films about life in Paramore.
And we're going to talk a little bit more about that when we come back. Welcome back to In Print. We're talking with Assistant Professor Natalie Underberg about folklore and the Foodways project, where UCF students got a chance to document the culture of the Paramore area through the children's noses and taste buds. And you said that there was really one particular story that a girl told that was very powerful, very simple, very succinct, which is kind of like folklore, and very powerful for all of you.
Yeah, the one that I remember when you just asked me about that is a story called The Smell of Griot, which is, if I remember correctly, a spicy pork dish that's a Haitian dish. And, she collected the recipe, and what she told us about, which, was really striking, was the connection that had to her memory. And she said when she walked in the house and she smelled the sort of spicy, pickly smell, she knew that her mother was really happy. She knew that something good had happened. And that was just such a good short story, because I think we can connect to that same idea. No matter what community you grew up in, there's probably a smell that you associate with something, which is really one way I think that Foodways was chosen as a focus for the project, because you can get to know people over food in a really non-threatening kind of way. I mean, we can talk about the sandwiches we like, and there's a bond that can happen. And so
what grandma made.
What grandma made. Certainly, we all share those kinds of memories. So Foodways is a way for people to connect cross-culturally as well as across generations.
And so there became a real bond, as you said, between the kids and the college kids. Little kids and college kids.
There were some really neat stories that came out, in the films as well. There was one really striking one about the FCAT, as I recall, and the effect of having this yearly test on the students on 3 levels. It was the way it affected the students, the way it affected the teachers, and the way it affected the administrators. It's a very tight piece about FCAT at Orange Center Elementary. And that's something it doesn't have to do specifically with Foodways, but that served as an entree to discover that story and sort of develop that story with the kids.
Actually, it was really quite brilliant to think of food, because it opened people up to the process of communicating and led to something deeper.
I think, yeah, and I think that was Kristen Congdon's idea, was the Foodways, and that was really very wise. And we thought initially, I co-taught a class with Sterling on this, working with the film students, and initially we thought, should they do films about foodways? That would seem logical. But, then we kind of realized in that organic process where people get ideas for stories that was maybe too limiting, that maybe that was the entree, and we would just let the students figure out what would, the story that was coming to them. And I think it made for more interesting stories.
And that's part of being in media too, because if you go into something with a set plan, an idea of how it's going to turn out, it's not going to be very good. You have to flow with it when you tell the story about what's happening. You can't control it.
That's a good way to look at it, and that sums up ethnographic research generally. You have a hypothesis, but you have to be open to what you actually see.
Because it may turn out very different.
Oh, yes.
Let's talk about Folkvine. This website was so cute. It's really, I hate to use the word cute, but it was made in such a whimsical, interesting, wonderful way. Imagine this. You're like going into a general store. Maybe, I almost pictured it like a tourist store with things for Floridiana, like a place I would buy a flamingo or something. But each part of the store has a portal to a part of folk art, folk stories, folk artists. Tell us about it.
This is a really neat project that's actually in its third year of funding, and it was started by Kristen Congdon and Craig Saper, who got to know each other with some shared interests, and I entered in as a folklorist. And there are two ways to search the site. You're describing the portal, exactly right, in terms of it was intended to evoke one of those roadside visitor centers, where they sell the boiled peanuts, and very Florida.
Those little coconut patties. See, we're talking about food again.
It's very Florida, absolutely. And so there are two ways to search it. One is to search it through the individual artists, and each artist's website is intended to look and feel like that artist's style. And
you find them through one of those squeaky little wire racks, and each artist is a postcard.
Absolutely, and this is again, our web designer, Chantal Fontaine, is just amazing, and she is able to actualize these ideas. We say, can you do this? And she'll figure out a way, and so she made it squeak when it turns around, and you pick up a postcard. So that's one way to search the site. The other way are through these humanities themes, ideas of how people recreate their identity through artwork, how people create a sense of place through their artwork, ideas of the connection between artistic practice and economic and social life.
Now, are these the guidebooks?
Those are the tour guides. And so again, it's sort of this imitative idea, right? You imitate picking up a postcard and going on that tour. You imitate picking up a tour guide, opening it up as a way to explore all of the sites at once according to a theme.
So that's what it is. It's almost like a magazine rack. You click on the tour guide, the book comes, you open it up, and there comes a central theme, a humanities theme, and you could go and view the artist this way.
And that's what's so interesting about it is I think you describe it correctly as whimsical and fun. At the same time, I think it's really theoretically rigorous. I mean, those are college level themes, placemaking, imagination.
Well, it's true. I told you when I looked at it and I said, "Oh my goodness, what is this?" But then once you go in, it explains it.
And I think that's part of the philosophy, and that's why we're in there as these bobbleheads making commentary on the sites. It's intended to be whimsical and intended to be just as highly academic as writing or as publishing something in an article. That's important to what we do, and that's important, I think, to my philosophy as a folklorist. This stuff is fascinating, and it's theoretical, and it's real, and those things are not mutually exclusive, in my opinion.
You mentioned the bobbleheads, and it may, without listing the website, people might be wondering what you're talking about. You have, what, 4 or 5 bobbleheads also in this store on this website, and they're bobbling their heads, but when you click on, they're actually professors.
They're professors and members of the team. Chantal, our web designer, is one of them. Lynn Tomlinson, who's our videographer, director of videography and art director, actually sculpted every single one of those. And they really do look like us. and they're intended to give us an opportunity to comment on what we see, not to displace the authority of the artist, but to complement it. We have things to say given our background. My background is in anthropology and folklore, so when I look at it, I have a certain perspective. Lisa Roney, who's an English professor, has a different perspective as a creative writer, et cetera, et cetera. And so those are us. We are the team members on there. And if you remember the experience of trying to set up this interview, Lynn Tomlinson.
They wanted to come together. They did. And I wanted you to come together. But as you see, we could have actually sat them on the floor, maybe.
But that's so important to who we are. We really are the Folkvine team, and we sort of speak of ourselves in the collective, because no one of us could have done this.
Right.
No one of us could have done this. And it's impossible to sort of sort out what everyone does, but the idea is it's a collaborative process amongst ourselves and a collaborative process with the artists.
A lot of people put together that website.
Absolutely, absolutely. It is a huge collaborative process.
Let's talk about the Cultural Heritage Alliance. Very amazing. All these things that I was finding as I was going through the computer. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, the Cultural Heritage Alliance was actually started when I came to UCF in, 2002. Originally, I was hired as a folklorist to try to help develop a regional folklife center. So we have a state folklore program, and they wanted something in the Central Florida region. Kristen Congdon is the director and I'm the program coordinator. And over maybe 3 or 4 years, it's really, really grown. And we do a number of projects. Folkvine is one of the projects. And in fact, Folkvine is bigger than we call it CHA, Cultural Heritage Alliance. It includes a number of other faculty from across the disciplines. So it's CHA and bigger than CHA. But the other projects, you know, that we've done, the Paramore Foodways project, we just finished a computer game mod that's actually based in 1930s Ybor City, based on a version of Cinderella. And so Cinderella walks around Ybor City and learns about the place.
And that was done along with the people from FIA, wasn't it? From the Florida International Education, or the other, is it digital media people?
Actually
was it with the digital, all through the digital media school?
It was.
Okay.
It was. It actually was done through digital media division.
And that takes tons of people to do something like a video game.
Again, and again, you know who programmed it? Chantal Fontaine. Turns out she can program computer games too. She's amazing. So, but I mean, so the idea is, you know, how can we use technology to present folk life in new ways? Partnership building is very important to us. So we try to do projects in connection with community groups, and all those things go together for us.
What's actually amazing is that you're going to need even a bigger team, because there are so many different groups and subgroups in Florida. We are probably the biggest melting pot here.
Oh yes, that's why I love Orlando. I was very excited to come here as a folklorist. My first job was to do basically a survey of the folklore in Central Florida, and it's just endless. I mean, everybody's here, and not just ethnic groups, occupational groups, you know, age
People
groups.
think of us as the theme park capital, but we're way more than that.
Absolutely. That's a big theme, I think, of the Cultural Heritage Alliance, is look deeper. If
there was one thing that really stood out in your mind of all the groups, was there something that surprised you after you moved here? You moved here from, was the last place you lived in California?
Well, that's where I'm from originally, yeah.
So you came here from California, probably having all kinds of ideas of what Florida or Orlando is like. What was your biggest surprise in relating that to what you do as a folklorist?
Well, I think the thing that most, I don't know if it surprised me, but it fascinated me, is one of my areas of research is Hispanic culture. And so, you know, I'm from California, and I'm used to Cinco de Mayo festivals, for example, which is a Mexican holiday. And when you come to Central Florida, I remember going to the Central Florida Fairgrounds, and I was listening to mariachi music, and I was eating Colombian steak, and you know, it's very sort of pan-Latin experience. And that relates really well, actually, to one of our artists, who's a friend of mine named Lily Carrasquillo. She's from Puerto Rico, and she's an artist who makes, among other things, vejegante masks, which are these masks that are worn during festivals in Puerto Rico. But she also makes sun masks, which are inspired by Mexican culture, ofrendas. I just went to an ofrenda making workshop she did in Tavares, and I made an ofrenda, which is a Day of the Dead altar for my great-grandmother. And it's this sort of not melting of traditions, but an influence of various traditions that come together in Central Florida.
We do keep our heritages here. A lot of different people keep the heritages here, which is kind of nice.
Exactly, exactly. I found that the most interesting, and that's why I really liked working on Lily's site on the Folkvine project. Because
I remember when I was working for a network affiliate, and they did marketing research. They said, well, there's all these different Latin subgroups. Then there are the Southerners. Then there are the very few native Floridians like me. And then there are the transplanted Northeasterners. And then there are the Midwesterners. There's almost everything. You could probably find stories from almost anywhere here.
Absolutely. That's why it's really fun to live here.
What's your next project? What's the next thing you're going to be working on?
A couple of things. One is we are trying to set up a Folkvine China. Kristen went to China, and she made these great connections with SUAD, which I can't remember, Shandong University. And we're trying to set up, and I'm writing lots of grants right now, to fund a research trip to China to try to do a similar project in China. And so it's not so much that we would be the cultural experts on China, but more that we're trying to share the technology and the process of creating the website. So not just the technology, but like that collaborative process of team building and brainstorming, which is a kind of, you know, eclectic thing that's hard to define how it is we do it. And so it'll be a good experience to try to explain that to someone else. And another thing is we're doing further work on the Turkey Maiden computer game.
Well, that's wonderful. Natalie Underberg, thanks so much for joining us. We have so much to talk about that we've got to make a point to do this again.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed it.
You're welcome. I'm Charna Davis-Wiese. Thank you for joining us for In Print, and we'll see you next time.